Moving on to the third stage, phase 6, basically we read repeatedly all of the initial posts to each thread, and we would write memos or make comments right on the quotations. Now, that is no longer reflected in this project file because I would tend to delete those comments on the quotations and delete the memos as we eventually moved that initial annotation into a code in order to represent our analysis. So phase 6A is not really represented in the project file in its final form. Moving on to phase 6B, we would go through, and as you can see, we would read through each of the initial posts of the thread, and we would attach the codes that seemed to represent what was happening in that section of the online conversation. Whenever we would see new codes, we would of course create a new code and apply that to those quotations, and then we would talk about that later as a research team. Phase 6C, whenever we would see something different in one of those initial posts, we would attach it to the variable memo. And you'll see if we go back and look at that, that was actually attached to 28 different quotations. 6D represents the fact that as we were working, we would need to come together and merge project files and take a look at the different ways that we attached codes to the quotations and then work through that together. Phase 6E, we retrieved the coded quotations linked to each code, and then we would discuss that and define them. So in Atlas, of course, if you open the code manager and double click on a code, you can then go through and look at every quotation that has that code happening. So in this case, there were 40 quotations in which the person writing actually announced that they were a newcomer to the community. Whenever we felt like we had each created new codes, we would have to merge those codes and rename and comment on them to explain the definition so that we were sure that we weren't using different codes to represent the same thing. And by the end of phase 6E, we had 11 codes. For some reason now in this project file we're down to 10, and I'm not sure why that is. Again, it's been a few years, but as we work with the data and work with the codes, we tend to refine and condense as we go along. So once we had gone through and coded all the data, in phase 7A, we needed to figure out what the patterns were in terms of what was happening in these posts in order to start writing the paper. So one thing I like to do at that point in the study is to take a look at the coded quotations and to sort them by density to see which quotations had the most codes attached to it. To me, this means that a lot is going on in this particular post. And so I could go through and see kind of some good examples of posts that had all of these activities going on and start to write a more narrative description of what we saw as happening in this pattern. And so finally in phase 7B, we would identify those quotations and then we would run a report. That just means we might take the top 4 quotations that had the most codes attached and run a report, and then take a closer look outside of the software to start to narratively write what we were seeing happening across those posts in terms of the pattern we were seeing about how people write about their grief.